Hello! What I thought I'd do today is to go over some woods that I use for wood carving. I'm going to go over woods that I can find very easily around where I live. I live in Wisconsin, which is in the Midwestern United States. Most of my carving is done with wood that I find. Basswood is the #1 wood for wood carvers pretty much universally. It's a nice wood for carving because it's soft. It has a Janka hardness rating of 410, which is very, very soft. There's only a few woods in the world which are softer than that. But not only that, it usually has a very straight grain and it doesn't splinter very much. I'm using basswood on my osprey carving that I'm doing right now, and I like to use a lot. But I use a bunch of different wood for carving. I'm going to go through the list, starting with some of the softer woods. And when I say softer, I'm not talking about the classification as far as deciduous and evergreen. I am talking about the Janka hardness scale, which is a scale used to determine how hard the wood is. In general, a lower Janka hardness means an easier wood to carve. I'm going to start with aspen. I don't have a piece in front of me of aspen, but I have carved in it before, and it is a nice soft wood. In fact, it has a Janka rating of 380, which is less than basswood. It tends to hold details very well, and I found it to have a nice shimmer on it once I put some oil on it. White pine is another wood that is softer than basswood. I personally have not used any white pine. I have used southern yellow pine to carve this. This was kind of a practice piece for me. And this actually is much harder than white pine. This is 870 on the Janka hardness scale, which is actually fairly tough. Most pines are a lot softer than that. Butternut. This is butternut here. It has a Janka hardness rating of 490. And I got this piece from a guy who was selling a bunch of his wood, and this was a piece that he had started and wasn't going to finish. So it's a good one to share with us. I have carved some other things in butternut. In fact, my very first 2 carvings were done in butternut. It's a nice wood to work with and holds detail very well. Poplar. I carved a chess set out of poplar, but poplar has a Janka rating of 540, and it's not too bad to carve. I don't think it holds the detail as well as some other species, but overall it wasn't a bad wood to work with. I've carved some things in white willow. This one here is in willow as well, but I believe it's called Crack Willow, which is actually an invasive willow in my area. But it grows by rivers quite a bit, and white willow doesn't tend to get this big around, at least not in my area. And I found this willow to be very easy to work with. So willow is another one that I would recommend, whether it be white willow, which will be a smaller in diameter, or this crack willow that you can find by creeks. Alder is another wood that tends to grow by creeks. The alder that I have around by me generally isn't very big, and I haven't harvested any alder by me. This alder came from the home center, and it wasn't too bad to carve. I think this is a little bit harder than the alder that grows natural around by me. It has a Janka rating of about 590. Silver maple, or soft maple, is a wood that I used for this wood carving. This is my first snake walking stick. And it carves not too bad. I found power tools were a little bit easier to use with it than just a knife. I did use knives and palm gouges for most of that carving. Boxelder is another wood that I'll use. What I like about Boxelder is you get this nice coloration in it. It's got like this lot of reds and purples that will show up in it. So if you get the right piece, you can get some really interesting look into it. Sycamore is a wood that I like to use. Actually, I find sycamore is one of my favorite woods, primarily because if it's quarter sawn, you get these very cool grains in here, and it's a really easy wood to carve. Sycamore is one that I highly recommend. It's not talked about enough as a good carving wood, and you get some really cool grain patterns from that quarter sawn wood. I carved this mask a while ago using American Elm, and elm is one of those woods that I really like to use. I haven't done a whole lot of work with elm using just a knife though. I've used gouges, and elm has interlocking grain, and I have a feeling that with just a knife it'll be a very difficult wood to work with. But with gouges, it is certainly one of my favorite woods to work with. I love the color of it. It will have a tendency to tear out a little bit because of that interlocking grain, so generally I have to sand a little bit more than other woods. The rest of the woods I'm going to talk about have a Janka hardness over 900, and sometimes those can be pretty difficult to work with. Cherry has a Janka hardness of about 950 or so, depending on the species. This is not black cherry. I believe this is either pin cherry or choke cherry. And I found it actually a fairly difficult wood to work with. It's certainly not one of my favorites. I think with a gouge and mallet it would be easier. With a knife it was not very fun to work with. This is one of my first carvings I ever did. It's a bear I did in walnut. I believe it's either my third or fourth carving. It's not a particularly good example, but I did this all with a knife, and it took a long time. Walnut has a Janka rating of over 1,000, about 1,010, and you can get away with just a knife, but it's starting to get pretty difficult. Most of the time I would use a gouge for this. One of my all-time favorite woods to work with is River Birch. I carved this one out of River Birch, and I've carved many things using that. And even though it's got a Janka hardness of about 970, which is getting up there, I find that it carves very well with a knife and palm gouges. Its cousin, the Paper Birch, that one I've carved before. That's a more difficult wood to work with, even though the Janka hardness is a little bit lower. For some reason I struggle more with that than I do with the River Birch. White oak is a really nice wood to work with. Again, mallet and gouges are the way to go with white oak. You can carve into it with a knife, but it would be pretty slow going and could be pretty frustrating. So I think my favorite woods besides basswood to work with are River Birch, Sycamore, Elm. Those three woods tend to be the ones I gravitate towards mostly. I really like working with those. Butternut would be another wood. I haven't worked with it a lot, but those are the woods I would recommend if you want to venture away from basswood and try carving in some other woods. Thanks for watching. I appreciate the support.